They attacked my mother, and she's barely alive. The giant farmer's reaction shocked everyone. A frightened little girl crosses the night alone to save her gravely injured mother. What she finds on the farm of a reclusive veteran completely changes both of their destinies. A powerful story of courage, solidarity, and new beginnings, set in a place where no one expected compassion. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The night had not yet given way to daylight when Lucy Carter finished the last seam. The Texas countryside felt colder than usual, and the wooden house where she lived with Maddie creaked with every gust of wind. On the table lay colored threads, scraps of day-old bread, and a pot of coffee gone cold that no longer warmed anyone. 2 years had passed since James had disappeared, but the debts he left behind still haunted them like a relentless ghost. Maddie slept in the next room, clutching her worn-out teddy bear, while Lucy scribbled numbers in a notebook, trying to find a way out of their bills. The sound of an engine in the distance broke her concentration. At first faint, then closer, until it stopped right in front of the door. She lifted her head, her heart pounding without knowing why. In the same instant, 2 shadows stretched across the thin window pane, and before she could react, the door was shoved inward with force, slamming against the wall and scattering dust from the dry wood. The men came in without asking permission, heavy boots dirtying the floor, the smell of gasoline and tobacco filling the cramped room. There were 2 of them, hats pulled low, worn jackets, one with an old scar running across his jaw. Lucy recognized their names when the bigger one spoke. Debt collectors after James. They hadn't come to negotiate, they had come to take. They demanded money, the car, anything of value. Lucy tried to explain she had nothing, that her husband had vanished, leaving only bills to pay, but her words came out shaky and were met with short, cold laughs. One of the men shoved a chair, the other knocked over the sewing machine. The larger man stepped closer, demanding immediate payment. When Lucy answered, there was nothing to give. The first blow came fast, a slap that sent her crashing onto the table. Maddie, who had woken up and hidden behind the iron stove, clamped her hands over her mouth to keep from crying out. The attack didn't last long, but left deep marks. They tore through their few belongings, ripped open sacks of flour, smashed the china cabinet Lucy had inherited from her mother. The larger man grabbed her by the hair and demanded once more money or jewelry, but there was none. Frustration boiled over into punches and kicks. Lucy tasted blood, but kept her body between the men and the bedroom door where Maddie was hiding, even without knowing her daughter was there. When one of the collectors finally said, "That's enough," they let her fall to the floor, coughing and trembling. They grabbed the few bills in the drawer and left the way they had come without looking back, leaving the door open to the wind and dust. The growl of the engine fading down the road etched itself into Maddie's memory. Lucy lay on her side on the floor, her face swollen and dark bruises spreading across her arms. A deep cut on her forehead bled steadily, staining the simple clothes she wore. Maddie crawled out of her hiding place, eyes wide, knees shaking, trying to remember everything her mother had taught her about staying calm. She knelt beside her, touching her shoulder, whispering her name, but Lucy's eyes were closed. There was life there, but fragile. The girl looked around the wrecked room, the broken sewing machine, food scattered, the door hanging off one hinge. The world as she knew it had ended that early morning. For a moment she thought of running to the road and screaming for help, but remembered the nearest house was miles away and there was no phone. Her eyes fell on the old blanket in the corner. She pulled it hard, covering her mother up to the neck, trying to protect her from the biting cold seeping through the cracks. Panic rose in her throat like a knot, but in the middle of it flickered a memory. The Turner farm, a name whispered among locals, tied to stories of harshness and isolation. Caleb Turner, the veteran who lived apart from everyone. No one knew if by choice or haunted by his past. Lucy had always told Maddie never to go near that place, but now every second felt like an eternity, and the image of her mother's pale face drowned out any fear. Maddie stood up, wiped her tears with her sleeve, and slipped on the worn-out flip-flops by the door. She drew a deep breath, the cold, dry air scratching her throat. She stepped outside through the open door, crossing the yard where a thin frost covered the hard-packed earth. The road seemed longer than ever for legs so small. The wind hit her tattered dress, lifting dust and bringing scents of dry grass and distant smoke. Maddie hugged her arms to her chest to fight the cold, each step making the sandals creak over the stones. In her mind, she repeated her mother's instructions to count to 100 when she was scared, but she'd lost track somewhere around 50. The sun was just beginning to edge over the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink, a beauty almost cruel for such a morning. She stumbled on stones, scraping her knees, but got up each time as if her mother's life depended on it, and in a way, it did. When she finally saw the corrals and the big house of the Turner farm in the distance, Maddie could no longer feel her feet. The ranch loomed large, tall fences, a sturdy wooden barn, an old pickup truck parked near the shed. In the yard, a man was fixing a fallen fence, gripping pliers tightly, his stance rigid despite the cold morning. He was Caleb Turner, exactly as her mother had described. Tall, broad-shouldered, short graying hair, stubble on his jaw, scars across his hands. His eyes, when he noticed the girl approaching, were cool, wary, used to keeping people at a distance. Maddie stopped a few yards away, her knees shaking, her heart racing. For an instant, she thought of turning back, but the memory of her mother's body on the floor pushed her forward. She took 2 more unsteady steps, her voice caught in her throat. The man frowned, set his tool down and waited. In the stillness of the Texas morning, the girl lifted her face, streaked with dust and tears, and managed to speak, each word a lifeline stretching toward the only hope she had left. Maddie was still trembling when she started to speak, her voice coming out in bursts of cold and fear, yet driven by an urgency that left no room for hesitation. In short, clipped sentences, she told Caleb what had happened that night. Men breaking into the house, demanding money that didn't exist, her mother bleeding on the floor, her father gone for 2 years, and debts now being collected in blood. There were no tears, no pleas, only the raw account of a child who had crossed the night alone to save the only person she had left. Caleb was crouched beside an old pickup, hands greasy, tightening the cap of a tank with a pair of pliers. As she spoke, he slowly straightened, the flashlight clipped to his pocket, casting an upward glow on the girl, highlighting her scraped feet in worn flip-flops, the dust-stained dress, and the determination in her eyes. Wind drifted through the boards of the shed, stirring fine dust. The truck's still warm engine gave off a faint smell of oil. For the first time in years, Caleb felt an echo of something he thought he had buried, memories of when there had been no one to come for him either. He set the tool down on the truck bed and straightened up with a heavy motion, as though each movement had to break through an invisible wall. The man known in the area as hard and unyielding now stood before a child whose story stripped away that facade without effort. He asked only where the house was, how long it had taken her to get there, and Maddie answered quickly, her voice nearly breaking but still steady. Caleb drew in a deep breath, eyes scanning the horizon as if measuring distance and consequences, then without another word walked over to the pickup's cab. Maddie followed, each step dragging with exhaustion, but pushed forward by the image of her mother on the floor. Inside the shed, the air smelled of dry hay, oil, and hot metal. The morning light came in through wide gaps in the boards. Caleb opened the door, checked the fuel, and grabbed a metal first aid kit he kept behind the seat, a reflex from his years of military service. With a firm motion, he helped Maddie climb into the passenger seat, settling her carefully so she wouldn't slip. The girl gripped the edge of the seat by instinct, even though she knew she had no strength to handle anything. Caleb walked around to the driver's side, started the engine, and shifted into gear. The rumble of the truck broke the dry morning stillness as it rolled down the dirt road. Maddie felt the wind seeping through the cracks in the window, her heart pounding now, not from fear, but from anxiety. The ranch was falling away behind them, while the long dirt road and old fences stretched ahead. Caleb said nothing, eyes fixed on the path, but inside his mind churned, weighing risks, picturing what he might find. He was a man accustomed to danger, but this was different. The distance Maddie had walked for hours on foot was now covered in minutes by the pickup. The rhythm of the engine made the world feel less frozen and closer to a solution. Caleb noticed the girl curled into the corner of the seat, exhausted but still awake, and thought about what he'd have to do next. He knew debt collectors like this. They were men who would return to finish the job if left unchecked. He was aware that by stepping in, he was bringing that threat into his own space, but he couldn't ignore the look in Maddie's eyes as she spoke about her mother. There was a controlled anger in him, not at the child, but at the repetition of a story he himself had lived. The dry wind came in through the window, but with each mile, Caleb felt less doubt and more clarity about what needed to be done. The cabin came into view ahead, a low silhouette in the empty field. Caleb slowed the truck, his eyes narrowing, scanning for any sign of movement. He saw no cars or men nearby, only the open door swinging in the wind and the roof askew. He stopped a few yards short and cut the engine, his muscles taut with anticipation. He motioned for Maddie to stay behind him and picked up the first aid kit. The girl, too tired to question, obeyed in silence, her gaze locked on the doorway. The smell of blood and splintered wood reached Caleb before he even crossed the threshold. He entered with firm steps, his heartbeat steady, not from lack of emotion, but from readiness. Lucy was on the floor, her face pale and the gash on her forehead deeper than he had imagined. Caleb knelt without wasting time, opening the metal kit and pulling out gauze and tape to press against the wound. His touch was quick but precise, as if he'd performed the same procedure countless times in far less domestic settings. With his other hand, he checked her pulse and breathing, his hardened expression focused entirely on the task. Maddie stood frozen in the doorway, fingers gripping the frame, wide eyes following every movement. Caleb draped a blanket over Lucy to keep the cold from worsening her condition and secured the bandage firmly. The room smelled of iron, oil, and desperation, but he didn't waver. When the initial treatment was done, he slipped an arm beneath Lucy and lifted her with a dry but steady care. He turned to Maddie and gave a short nod. No speeches, no promises. He carried Lucy out of the cabin, the girl running behind him, and together they settled the unconscious woman on the back seat, propping her up with improvised pillows. Caleb started the engine, shifted gears, and headed back down the road to the ranch. Maddie clutched the edge of the seat, looking from her mother to the horizon, feeling the truck shake beneath the tires. There were no guarantees, no words of comfort, only decisive movement toward a place where help might be found. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, fully aware that from that moment on, those two lives were his responsibility. The truck's engine rumbled beneath Maddie's feet as the dirt road slipped by, faster than she could take in. Lucy's body, carefully propped on the back seat with improvised pillows, swayed with every bump, and Caleb kept one eye on the rearview mirror to make sure she didn't slide. The girl, curled up in the passenger seat, felt the cold wind slip through the cracks in the window and sting her face. But she didn't look away from her mother, searching for any sign of breath. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that clashed with the gravity of the moment. Caleb's eyes stayed on the road, calculating each curve, alert to any danger as the pickup rolled steadily forward. Maddie, exhausted, sometimes let her head lean against the glass, but kept her small hands pressed to the dashboard, as if that grip alone kept her mother alive. When they passed through the wooden gate of the Turner Ranch, the yard dogs barked at the unusual urgency. Caleb didn't waste a second. He pulled the truck up to the porch, shut off the engine, and in one sure movement lifted Lucy from the back seat, carrying her inside the big house. Maddie ran behind him, feeling solid ground beneath her flip-flops for the first time since the night began. The interior of the house was simple and orderly, smelling of dry wood and fresh coffee. Without hesitation, Caleb took the stairs two at a time and went into the upstairs bedroom, the only one with a decent bed and clean sheets. He laid Lucy carefully on the mattress, removed her shoes, and slid a pillow under her head. Maddie stopped at the door, wide-eyed, unsure if this was a refuge or just a pause before more pain. Caleb turned to a low cabinet and pulled out the first aid kit he always kept ready, flipping it open on the table. Inside were bandages, ointments, bottles of alcohol, and instruments wrapped in clean cloths. He worked silently, washing his hands in a basin of warm water before inspecting each wound, cleaning, disinfecting, and dressing them with a precision born of military experience. Maddie watched from the corner, hugging her knees, her gaze moving between her mother and the man who until now had only been a name whispered with fear. The scent of herbs mixed with alcohol filled the room, and the girl felt a thin thread of relief at seeing Lucy's breathing become steadier. Caleb adjusted his own breathing between bandages, his face hard but focused, as if working in an improvised field station rather than a farmhouse bedroom. When the first round of care was finished, Caleb covered Lucy with a heavy blanket, checked her pulse, and, satisfied with the temporary stability, went downstairs to heat water and prepare something to eat. Maddie followed in silence, her feet dragging across the wooden floor. He poured a glass of warm milk, cut a slice of bread, and pushed it gently toward her, but she refused with a small gesture, climbing the stairs again to return to her mother's side. Caleb stood for a moment looking at the untouched plate, then turned off the stove and went back up as well, carrying a jug of clean water and extra cloths. Lucy lay still, but the color was returning to her face, a sign that her body was responding to the care. Maddie sat on the edge of the bed, gripping her mother's hand as if to anchor her there. A short while later, the sound of an engine coming up the dirt road drew Caleb to the window. It was the town doctor, a thin man in a worn hat who owed him a favor from a long-ago harvest. Caleb went down, greeted him on the porch, and led him straight to the room. The doctor examined Lucy quietly, checking the dressings already applied, and murmuring that with rest and care, she had a good chance of recovery. He recommended constant vigilance for the next 24 hours and left a few bottles of medicine before heading out. Maddie barely looked up during the visit, her attention fixed on her mother's breathing, while Caleb gave a short nod of thanks and saw the doctor to the door. When he returned to the bedroom, the girl was still in place, her eyes on Lucy's face, her small body trembling with exhaustion. He moved closer, pulled a heavy chair over, and sat down beside the bed. He watched Maddie for a few seconds, realizing she was fighting to stay awake. Without a word, he took a folded blanket from the corner and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth made her eyes close for a moment, and at last her body gave in, her head resting on the edge of the bed while her hand still held her mother's. Caleb stayed there, too big for the simple chair, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the two of them. It wasn't a calculated gesture or rehearsed compassion. It was simply what needed to be done. The ranch, silent and empty for years, now held two new hearts beating inside it, and Caleb remained seated in quiet vigil as the midday light filtered through the heavy curtains. The first days passed slowly, marked by a restrained routine of care. Lucy, still covered in bruises, drifted in and out of short stretches of sleep, her consciousness returning bit by bit like someone rising from deep water. Maddie spent most of her time in the bedroom, perched on a small chair, watching her mother's face and holding her hand tightly. Caleb came and went, bringing clean water, warm milk, fresh towels to change the bandages, never lingering for conversation or explanations. The ranch, long used to the sound of his footsteps alone, now echoed with the rustle of light dresses, the shuffle of a little girl's flip-flops, and the soft murmur of voices trying not to disturb. When Lucy opened her eyes for the first time after the attack, Maddie felt a knot loosen inside her chest. Her mother was alive, weak but alive. Caleb simply checked her pulse, adjusted the blanket, and left the room without ceremony, as if that gesture was enough. As Lucy regained strength, Maddie began following Caleb around the ranch, becoming a small shadow that trailed him from dawn until dusk. She watched him refuel the pickup, feed the dog and chickens, mend fences, clean tools, and inspect the small garden behind the barn, every movement marked by a discipline learned in the hard years of military service. Caleb, used to solitude, tried to ignore her constant presence, but her attentive eyes found him anyway. At first he answered only with grunts or nods, but soon he began giving brief replies to her questions. How to plant seeds, how to identify herbs in the field, how to treat an animal's wounds. Maddie soaked up every word like someone discovering a new world, still shy but growing more confident. There was in the air a thread of normalcy she hadn't felt in a long time. Lucy, meanwhile, feeling stronger, insisted on getting up to help in the kitchen. At first, Caleb tried to stop her, saying only that she needed rest, but she met him with a firm look that left no room for argument. She began washing clothes at the outdoor basin, humming softly to distract Maddie, and carefully reorganizing the cabinets. There was no romance, only a discreet mutual respect. She occupied a space that hadn't been offered as charity, and he accepted her presence as something natural without imposing himself. The house, once rigid and functional, began to show small signs of domestic life. Bright cloths on the tables, the smell of simple food drifting from the kitchen, a makeshift vase of flowers on the window. Maddie started playing again, chasing the ranch dog, laughing as she tried to help Caleb with tools too heavy for her hands. As the weeks went by, Caleb realized that despite living one day at a time, this situation couldn't continue forever. The men who had attacked Lucy could return, and he didn't want to offer only temporary shelter. At night, sitting on the porch while the two slept upstairs, he thought of alternatives, talking to the sheriff, using old contacts to track the men down, finding a way to settle the debt or remove the threat for good. The veteran who had once cared only for land and animals now found himself planning strategies to protect two people who had never asked to be there. It was a burden he carried in silence, telling no one, but it was shaping his actions. Maddie, unaware of these thoughts, kept learning the ranch routine as if it were a private school. She helped collect eggs, fed calves with improvised bottles, and repeated the names of plants Caleb taught her, proud when she could identify them on her own. The farmer gradually realized that the child wasn't just imitating, but understanding the processes, asking questions that showed she was thinking them through. What had started as forced coexistence was slowly turning into a bond of trust. Lucy noticed the change in her daughter, saw her face grow rosier and her eyes livelier, and felt a quiet gratitude for this man who promised nothing but offered a safe space to breathe. Afternoons took on their own rhythm. Lucy in the kitchen making cornbread while Maddie ran through the yard with the dog. Caleb hammering a plank or checking the garden. The sun lowering over the open fields, turning the suspended dust golden. There were no speeches, no plans laid out aloud, but the routine built a trust that grew stronger every day. As Caleb gathered his tools at the end of the workday, he began to accept that these two people were already part of his life. The ranch, which for years had been only a place to survive, was becoming a place of rebuilding. And even without admitting it to himself, he knew he would have to act to make sure this fragile peace wouldn't be shattered by the same men who had started it all. The mood at the ranch began to shift days before anything actually happened. Caleb had spotted fresh tire tracks near the back fence and footprints that weren't his or Maddie's. The wood on the gate showed scratch marks, as if someone had tried to force the lock. That morning he lingered longer than usual on the porch, eyes fixed on the distant road, his body tense as though he already knew what was coming. When he went back inside, Lucy was moving about the kitchen, and Maddie was folding cloths in the corner. He said nothing at first, simply poured himself some coffee and watched them. Then, in a firm voice that left no room for questions, he told them to pack only the essentials and stay in the interior room until he came for them. Lucy understood by his tone this wasn't a whim. It was a warning. She took Maddie by the hand and went upstairs, locking the door with the key Caleb had given them. The silence left in the house carried a new weight. Caleb spent the afternoon preparing the grounds the way someone sets up a board before a decisive game. He shut the windows on the east side, placed tools and buckets of sand near the doors, and checked the weapons he'd kept since his military service. He calmly loaded the shotgun, tested the mechanism, and set it within reach. In the barn, he secured the animals and turned off the yard lights to deny visibility, then went back to the living room and dimmed half the lamps. Each movement was methodical, calculated to buy precious seconds if he needed to act. There was no hatred or adrenaline, only the clear-headedness of someone who'd been through ambushes and knew how to survive them. The veteran who had hidden for years behind a farmer's routine was back, ready to defend a place that was no longer his alone. The sound of an engine in the distance confirmed his suspicions before dusk. Two silhouettes appeared on the road in an old pickup, the same men who had beaten Lucy weeks earlier. They approached with an easy confidence, perhaps expecting to find only a worn-out recluse incapable of resistance. Caleb waited inside, breathing steady, his grip firm on the cold barrel of the shotgun. When the door flew open with a kick, he neither retreated nor shouted. He rose slowly from his chair, the gun held low but ready, and faced the first man. The leader smirked, started to step forward, but stopped when he met Caleb's hard gaze, a look that promised no bluff. The confrontation was quick and taut, like a live wire. Caleb used the space he had prepared to his advantage, knocking the first man down with a blow to the arm, holding the revolver and shoving him against the wall. The second tried to pull a knife, but stumbled over a bucket Caleb had placed on purpose and lost his footing, taking a hard shove that left him disoriented. The leader, more experienced, tried to negotiate, but Caleb was already a step away, disarming him with a sharp twist of the wrist and pressing his own weapon to the man's chest without firing. No shots were fired, only the sound of metal on wood and ragged breathing. The entire room seemed to shrink under the weight of that tension. At that moment, a slight noise made Caleb turn his head. Through the crack of the hallway door, he saw Maddie, wide-eyed, gripping the knob as if needing to be sure he was all right. The girl's gaze cut through him like a silent plea. Caleb drew in a long breath, lowered the gun a few inches, and spoke in a low, almost hoarse voice to the men. "Leave. Now." The leader hesitated, but the firmness in Caleb's tone and the blood running from his partner's brow were enough. Caleb stepped back, keeping them at gunpoint until they crossed the threshold. Before they climbed into their truck, he added, "Spread the word. No one touches this place again. Not her, not the girl." The men, beaten and dirty, didn't look back. When the last sound of the engine faded down the road, Caleb lowered the shotgun and let out a long breath, an air he seemed to have been holding for years. He closed the door slowly, locked it, and rested his forehead against the wood for a moment. Then he climbed the stairs with steady steps, opened the interior room, and found Lucy holding Maddie in the corner. Their eyes mixed fear and relief. He simply told them it was over and they could come out. There was no speech, no celebration, only the quiet certainty that something had changed. Caleb was no longer just a temporary protector. By choosing to face those men instead of running, he had taken on risks that sealed a new pact. That night, as he stored the weapon and checked the windows, he felt the ranch shift from a provisional refuge to a home worth defending. The days that followed the confrontation brought a different kind of quiet to the Turner Ranch. It wasn't the tense hush of waiting, nor the emptiness Caleb had cultivated for years, but a new space where fear slowly dissolved. Lucy regained her strength, walking through the kitchen with a hand on the wall, feeling each step push away the shadow of the men who had attacked her. Maddie no longer shrank at the sound of engines in the distance, and for the first time since their flight, she dared to open the window by herself to watch the sunrise. Caleb noticed these small changes without comment, quietly holding on to the relief of knowing the immediate threat had passed. While he repaired the fence, he would see the girl sitting on a makeshift bench, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, and Lucy folding linens near the porch, her low humming filling the house with a thread of normalcy. One clear afternoon, Lucy approached him with a decision made. She said she couldn't live on the run anymore, couldn't stand the thought of putting Maddie back on the road without direction. She spoke calmly, asking for nothing, simply explaining that she needed to find a dignified way to start over. Caleb paused his work, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at her for a long moment. Then, without ceremony, he made an offer that would change the course of all three lives. He explained it wasn't charity or a debt. The farm was far too big for one man alone and needed the kind of care he'd never managed to maintain. Lucy could take charge of the household and the garden, and Maddie would have a safe place to study, play, and grow without fear. The invitation was simple, direct, and respectful, and Lucy felt it came not from pity, but from acknowledgement. She drew a deep breath before answering. There wasn't much to think about. Everything about this ranch showed Caleb kept his word. She accepted not out of desperation, but by choice, and that made all the difference. When Maddie, who had overheard part of the conversation, ran to wrap her arms around Caleb's legs and called him our friend with an open smile, he was left speechless. The child's gesture pierced through any armor. Caleb crouched slowly, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said only that from now on they were in it together. It wasn't a grand promise, but a quiet agreement among three people marked by loss who now chose to stay side by side. The routine began to shift gradually, almost without them noticing. Lucy reorganized the kitchen, hung clean cloths in the windows, and rekindled the old wood stove that had sat unused. Maddie insisted on digging a small patch in the yard, planting flowers alongside the herbs Caleb used for treating wounds. The ranch that once smelled of wood, oil, and iron now carried the scent of baking bread, herbal tea, and clothes drying in the sun. At dusk, while the dog ran across the yard, a child's voice echoed through hallways where only creaking boards had spoken before. Caleb discovered these changes didn't weaken him. On the contrary, they gave back a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he'd lost. Years later, the Turner Ranch was no longer known just for its production. The fences were sturdy, the garden yielded fresh vegetables, and Lucy had started a small sewing business, making clothes for neighbors and travelers passing through. Maddie grew up healthy, attending school in the nearby town and helping with chores naturally, learning from Caleb how to care for animals, read the weather, and be brave without losing compassion. Visitors found it unusual to see a war veteran, a seamstress, and a young girl living like a family without ties of blood or marriage, but there stood a home as solid as any, built through the daily practice of partnership and respect. A summer twilight painted the Turner Ranch in shades of orange and gold. On the porch after a day's work, Caleb sanded a tool handle while Lucy, seated beside him, finished an embroidery, and Maddie played with a handful of freshly picked flowers. The warm wind stirred the flower beds the girl had planted and carried the smell of bread from the kitchen. The house that had once been a lonely refuge now breathed life, voices, light footsteps, and small gestures transforming every room. Maddie rested her head on Caleb's arm without a word, and Lucy lifted her eyes from her stitching with a serene smile. In the simplicity of that evening, the three of them were building a true home made of trust, care, and shared choices. The end. So what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.